I Pity the Foo on NES Works episode 111. Now here's a game that makes me question my values as a video game documentarian. All video games are worthy of study and discussion, but are all games necessarily worthy of commercial release? This is the conundrum of Kung Fu Heroes. As a spring 1989 release for NES, Kung Fu Heroes comes across as painfully archaic. As someone who clearly remembers that era, and the kind of game experiences my peers and I clamored for, I can assure you that Kung Fu Heroes did not hit the mark. I'd blame the age of the source material, a 1984 arcade game called Chinese Hero, but that doesn't really fly when Kung Fu Heroes sat alongside NES conversions of Ultima Exodus, 1983, Gyrus, 1983, and Qbert, 1982, all of which had more of a place in the 89 NES lineup than this mess of a release. I suppose I can understand why Culture Brain would dare to publish this alongside the likes of Ninja Gaiden and The Guardian Legend, but that doesn't mean they exercised anything like good judgment in doing so. Kung Fu Heroes would have been a perfectly tolerable 1985 Famicom release, from that era when third parties suddenly flooded the Japanese market, typically demonstrating far more enthusiasm for soaking up some bubble-era yen than they did a fundamental understanding of programming for the Rico 2803. By that standard, Kung Fu Heroes looks pretty good, but it comes across much less convincingly here in '89. However, publisher Culture Brain didn't really have much else to go with. Formerly Nihon Games, Culture Brain anchored its existence in the video games space based on the minor coin-op success of Chinese Hero. Then they kept right on milking that scrawny excuse for a cash cow for the better part of a decade. Kung Fu Heroes directly adapted the arcade machine to NES, including its sole redeeming feature, two-player cooperative action, the ultimate video game band-aid for gaping wounds of compelling design and viable quality. The game made its Famicom debut in June 1986, and it might actually be the most mid-1986 game on the console. By that I mean, it shipped 9 months after Super Mario Bros., which meant that Culture Brain's programmers would have had just enough time to see that game, take a few hasty notes, and do their best to infuse a little Super Mario magic into their own efforts. Now, this does not mean that they made maximal use of the NES's capabilities, or integrated best-in-class controls and physics into their project, but they did add a whole lot of elements that will remind you of that other, much better game. Fundamentally, however, Kung Fu Heroes is a lower-tier experience in the format of the original Mario Bros., a cooperative game in which a player or two wander around a single screen trying to destroy a set number of enemies. In this case, you don't need to take out every single enemy that appears. Often, you can't. Kung Fu Heroes involves your heroes wielding a variety of weapons and power-ups that appear without any particular rhyme or reason, and many enemies will only go down when hit with a specific weapon, which you may or may not have access to. Instead, you simply need to take out a dozen foes per stage, any foes. This will unlock the door to the next level, which you can scramble through in order to jump ahead to the next stage. This defines the fundamental gameplay loop of Kung Fu Heroes, and it's entirely in line with the workings of the arcade game. But from what I can tell, and bear in mind that I've never actually seen the original coin-op in real life, Kung Fu Heroes appears to add a lot of embellishments, most of which come off as desperate ploys to sponge up some of the Super Mario mojo. For starters, your quest to rescue Princess Min Min now spans not a dozen stages, but rather 32 levels, which you traverse in groups of 4 across 8 worlds. This should sound familiar. However, you don't necessarily have to conquer all 32 levels. In keeping with the theme of the day, you can occasionally reveal entrances to bonus screens by collecting a key, which unlocks a secret passage. Some of these extra screens consist of timed contests to collect power-ups and bonuses, but others present you with a pair of pipes, which will warp you to other stages. Warp pipes, you say? Finally, Kung Fu Heroes takes an element found in the original arcade game, stage layouts defined by scattered strands of rocks and bricks, and gives it the full Mario treatment. Now you have the ability to shatter bricks and rocks by punching them, and more often than not, a power-up will emerge when you do. Some bricks don't break after a single hit, and you can continue pounding them in rapid succession in order to cause a flood of extras to pour forth. And just to drive the point home, in case you weren't clear that Culture Brain dearly wanted their game to trigger the endorphins players experienced while playing the greatest Famicom release to that point, Kung Fu Heroes shamelessly swipes sound effects from Super Mario Bros. It's especially egregious when you snag a fireball power-up, a seemingly new feature that works almost exactly the way Mario's fire attacks would if they were in a forced 3/4 perspective. See also Super Mario 3D Land. And they sound exactly like Mario's fireball attacks. I have to assume that Nintendo gave this thing the seal of approval instead of a restraining order out of admiration for the sheer chutzpah involved in such a brazen lift of that bit of cultural iconography. But make no mistake, Kung Fu Heroes does not play anything like Super Mario Bros. Oh, you can jump around, sure, but as a forced perspective action game, this works more like a sloppy, hoppy take on The Legend of Zelda. Kung Fu Heroes pens you into a tiny, confined space where random enemies spawn and wander around. These largely consist of dudes wearing increasingly elaborate hats, and they attack our heroes with the same attacks that players have access to. Incidentally, the heroes are named Jackie and Lee, in case you were under the mistaken impression that Kung Fu Heroes has even a scrap of creativity to offer to the medium. While Jackie and Lee can dispatch basic dudes with simple punches or flip kicks, the more dramatically coiffed foes require more effort. Some of them wield long-range weapons like pitchforks and blunderbusses, forcing you to be mindful of your approach. Others can't be destroyed with standard attacks, meaning you either need to luck into an upgrade, like fireballs or swords, or else avoid the bruisers while focusing on lower-tier Zako to rack up the numbers you need to reach the next stage. Kung Fu Heroes borrows liberally from Super Mario Bros., but Culture Brain only really looked to superficial elements for their skullduggery. Sound effects, hidden items, warp pipes, and a 32-stage structure are all well and good. But those details were merely window dressing in Nintendo's classic, grace notes atop a masterpiece of a game. Yet you will find none of the substantive fundamentals that made Mario so good here. World-class, medium-defining level design? Not in a game that consists entirely of small arenas filled with rocks. Incredible controls and meticulously crafted physics? Far from it. In fact, those might actually be the single worst thing about Kung Fu Heroes. Its design feels bracingly hateful. The forced 3/4 perspective makes it difficult to predict how characters will interact with one another. And you'll whiff attacks that seem like they should line up as frequently as you'll fall victim to enemy attacks that look like they should fly wide of your hapless martial artist. Oh, and it's entirely possible, and likely, that after dying, your protagonist will respawn more or less on top of an enemy that will kill you before you can react, since Kung Fu Heroes has never heard of mercy invincibility. You'd better believe that I used an infinite lives cheat recording this episode. In my gameplay notes, I jotted down the words archaic, sloppy, and unfair to describe Kung Fu Heroes. None of the videos and write-ups I've poured over since then have convinced me to change my mind. This is quite simply a sad excuse for a release this late in the NES lineup. Slapdash games like this could subsist on the appeal of simultaneous multiplayer in the early days of the NES. Just think about how many people somehow like IKARI Warriors. But at this point, we've had our fill of world-class co-op releases like Contra and Life Force, and a creaky old game like this absolutely does not cut it. That's not to say Culture Brain didn't have their hands on the germ of a promising idea here. The basic action design of Kung Fu Heroes would become a major element of the magic of Scheherazade, a game that, while perhaps not a scintillating masterpiece, certainly stands out as one of the more interesting and ambitious genre crossovers ever to appear on NES. But you have to walk before you can run, and as Kung Fu Heroes demonstrates, you have to fumble awkwardly before you can walk. After the mess that was Kung Fu Heroes, this episode's backup title is a welcome breath of fresh air for pretty much everyone. Admittedly, it's a golf sim, which doesn't seem like something that would spark joy for anyone who's not a 60-year-old dude. But the thing about golf games is that they were a solved problem by 1989. Any competent developer could make a satisfying golf simulator by simply sticking to the basics. And sure enough, this being a game with Bandai in the title, that competent developer turns out to be Tosei. Surprisingly, it's the first time we've seen the ubiquitous Ghost developer try their hand at golf, at least to my knowledge. But putting aside games whose profit margins were ravaged by licensing fees and left nothing for the actual development budget, think Muscle and Gundam. Kosei's original output for Bandai has been pretty solid. That describes Bandai Golf in a word: solid. It looks pretty lousy compared to other golf titles of the era, like Great Golf on Master System, but Bandai didn't try to reinvent any wheels here, and their steady approach works just fine. Bandai Golf lacks the personality and visual interest of, say, Lee Trevino's fighting golf, but looks aren't everything in this genre. Nor is sound, thankfully, given that the musical accompaniment thrust upon you here sounds like a rejected Super Cassette Vision score. What really matters are the gameplay, the physics, and the course design. That last one is practically a gimme, since Bandai Golf proudly boasts its key selling feature right there in the subtitle: Challenge Pebble Beach. The entire game spans a virtual rendition of one of the most famous courses in the world, a legendary green near Monterey, California, well known for its challenging ocean winds. While not the first ever video game to recreate a real course, Bandai Golf is certainly the first we've seen on NES, and so far as I can tell, the first to appear on any console in the US following the NES's debut. And its take on Pebble Beach doesn't simply stop at reproducing 18 real-world holes. Bandai Golf attempts to capture the spirit of the course by being the first console golf title we've seen to incorporate dynamic wind as a play factor. Now, wind always factors into any post-NES golf rendition of the sport worth bothering with. Players need to pay heed to the wind direction and speed each time they tee up in order to calculate how they should direct their swing to counter its force. However, Bandai Golf stands apart by treating wind as a real-time factor. Rather than setting a randomized value for speed and direction at the outset of each stroke, the game instead allows the wind indicator to shift erratically as you square off to take your swing. This adds an extra element of unpredictability to play, since you can't totally account for the variable. This doesn't really have that much impact on each hole, since the wind rarely seems to make dramatic changes as you try to take aim. And in any case, it's not like you have totally fine control over the direction of your swing. The plain simplistic interface of Bandai Golf doesn't give you anywhere near 360 degrees of precision as you take aim at the green. Your first swing or two on each hole work literally in broad strokes, leaving you to hone in on the cup during your follow-ups. So the wind's influence is just part of the overall imprecision of the game. Despite the imprecise feel of the initial tee-off, it doesn't take long to get a handle on Bandai Golf's mechanics. As always, a sure test of a golf sim's quality is whether or not you can perform consistently at the tee before the end of a single game, and that's certainly within the bounds of reason here. It may not have the most exciting presentation, and the music is about as fun as having a tee shoved into your ear like a spike, but even so, Bandai Golf is a solid contender that punts well below par here in the final innings, or something. Sports. Oh, and what did Nintendo Power say? Pretty much exactly nothing. Would you be surprised to learn that neither of these games featured heavily in the pages of Nintendo Power? Bandai Golf received a brief video shorts blurb in issue 3, while Kung Fu Heroes showed up in its own video shorts blurb in May-June 1989. In both cases, the magazine was then allowed to focus on more notable releases. Next time on NES Works, a real American ninja.